I'm going to show you the process for creating a Cumulo cluster inside of AWS, setting up replication from an existing on-premise Cumulo cluster to our Cumulo file system in AWS, uh, failing over from our primary Cumulo file system to the file system in AWS, and then failing back to our primary file system again. So just the whole process, kind of standing things up, configuring replication. First thing we're going to do is log into our AWS environment. Existing Cumulo file systems currently in our AWS tenant, so no current Cumulo environments running. And then what we're going to do is actually run a Terraform script to provision a Cumulo cluster inside of AWS. So while this process runs, it takes about 2 minutes for it to complete to stand up the cluster. If we flip back over to our AWS console and do a refresh of our stacks, we see that we currently have a Cumulo file system currently in process of being created. Okay, so we can see that our provisioning process is completed, our Terraform script is run, and then we will log into the Cumulo cluster using the username admin and the password that we provided in the stack output. Okay, so now that we've logged into our Cumulo cluster, we can see that this is a new file system. There's no data in here currently, not a lot of activity since the file system is very new and very fresh. And if we come over here and we look at our SMB shares, we can see that we have the default file share that comes with the new Cumulo file system deployment. But there's no data on here, no real configuration that's been performed. So best practices, we want to come in here and actually change our admin password now so we don't have to remember that funky password that was provided by Terraform. So let's just go ahead and change that right now. Okay. And now that we have our password set, the next thing we want to do is let's try and connect to this file system from a client. So we're going to open up our file browser here. And I'm going to need that file system address. So let's copy that. And now I want to browse to my Cumulo file system running in AWS. Now I'll be prompted for authentication here. This is where I want to put in my username again and the new password that I have set for accessing this cluster. And I'll see that my file shares is there, but I have no data currently on my AWS file system or my Cumulo file system in AWS. Okay, so the next thing we want to do then is we want to connect to the local Cumulo file system or my on-premise instance. So we're going to open up a new file browser. And in this case, we're going to browse to Cumulo 1. Again, I'm going to be asked for credentials. This is a different file system, so we will enter our credentials here. And we'll see on this file system, I actually do have not only a couple of shares, but also have some data that exists on this particular file system. We can see on this file system that I actually do have some data that exists, a couple of files, some directories that exist here. Again, this is a fairly new cluster we stood up for demo purposes, so not a lot of historical performance data, but data here nonetheless. And what we want to do is we want to establish a replication relationship. On my on-premise cluster, I want to replicate. I'm just going to do my entire directory structure, so we will start from the root. I want to replicate that to my Cumulo file system in AWS. I'm going to be provided the cluster IP address for my Cumulo file system in AWS. So let's grab this address again. and then we'll click Save Relationship. Now you'll see it tells me that it's awaiting authorization on the target cluster, so I'm going to go to my file system in AWS, where it lets me know that there's a pending authorization for replication, and we're going to authorize it. Now that that's completed, if we go back over to our primary Cumulocluster cluster here within a few seconds, we should see that a replication process has begun. I can view the details of this relationship and see things like throughput, when the last run was, how many files, or how much data is changed as part of that replication process. So while that's running, if I go back over and begin to look at my file system in AWS, you'll see that I now have that same NFS and SMB directory inside of my files folder, file share on the AWS file system. Now, when we create replication pairings, the file system on the primary side is read-write. The file system that we are replicating to is read-only. So if I try and take, let's say this Ice Age folder here, drop it over here and try and put it on my AWS file system, you'll see that I get a access denied. Can't write to that file system currently. But if I take that same folder and I drag it and drop it over here on my on-premise file system, not only does it copy, but here within a few seconds, we should see that the Cumulo file system will pick up that change on the primary side and replicate that directory and its the file contents to the file system in AWS. So we can see now that the replication has picked up those changes. I now see the Ice Age folder in my file system on AWS, and the contents match. Okay, so now that we've demonstrated, I've quickly stood up my file system, my Cumulo file system in AWS. I've replicated some existing data over to it. Let's simulate a scenario whereby my on-premise Cumulo file system fails. So the easiest way to do that is we're going to go in here and simply shut this cluster down. So in doing so, I now no longer have access to my Cumulo file system on the primary side. If I try to browse my data over there, of course, that's just going to sit and spin. But I do still have access to my Cumulo file system on the AWS side. Challenge being, obviously, my Cumulo file system in AWS is still read-only. So the first thing we want to do is come into my replication view in the AWS file system and make this target writable. I want to get a quick dialog that's going to tell me what changes are going to be made as part of this process. Click yes, make this target writable. And then now, if I come over to my folder here, and let's say I want to move this twister file, we'll see that now I can write to this file system, and it has begun copying data into my file system in AWS. So while that's copying, let's go ahead and say we want to power back up our on-premise cluster. So I'm going to get that thing started back up for us. If I look at my web UI here, we'll see that currently it's telling me this cluster is still offline, but once the cluster comes back, this page should refresh, letting us know that the cluster is booting back up. And we can see now that my on-premise file system has come back online. And I can see, if I look at replication status, that currently my replication status is disconnected, the relationship is disconnected, and the target is currently writable. So because we're making changes on the cloud side, we've written some data there during this DR event. We want to make sure that we replicate those changes back to the primary file system so that we don't lose any of that data, any of those changes that occurred during our DR event. Okay, so my copy is completed. As I mentioned, we want to come in here on my AWS file system, and I want to reverse the relationship. I get a quick dialog here that tells me the changes that are going to be made. I need to tell it what cluster just to confirm where I want to replicate this data to. So we're going to plug into here our IP address for our primary cluster. Okay. Once we have that in there, we're going to reverse the relationship. And then the next thing we'll need to do is reconnect the on-premise cluster to the AWS instance. So we're going to come to our on-premise Cumulo file system, reconnect relationship. Tells me that the source is my Cumulo file system in AWS. It's going to replicate to this cluster. But in the after configuration, this cluster is going to be read-only. So say yes. And now if we go and we look at our file data that we have for these two file systems, we'll notice that my on-premise Cumulo file system is already starting to pick up some of these changes and replicate that Twister folder back to my on-premise Cumulo file system. Okay. Basically, to get back to the way things were at the very beginning, the process is as simple as coming into here, making the target writable on the primary side. I want to reverse this relationship. And then on my AWS side, I want to come over here and simply reconnect the relationship, which tells me at the end, my Cumulo file system on premise is going to be writable. My AWS file system is again going to be read-only. And that's it. That's the process of failing over and failing back a Cumulo file system from on-premise to AWS.